This is a existential worldwide problem. We're not going to solve it by ourselves, and we need to work together. So that's like the foundation. The other piece is we really can't take care of our emotional well-being by ourselves either.
Hi, welcome to Everyday Climate Champions, where we speak with inspiring community members here in the San Francisco Bay Area about how they're putting real climate solutions into action.
Thank you for joining me, Sean Mendelson, as your host for this episode of Everyday Climate Champions. Today's topic is how to raise children while coping with climate anxiety. As we face the inevitable climate-related issues during the climate transition of this decisive decade, it's important to take care of the negative psychological impact of climate change. Time magazine defined climate, or eco-anxiety, as a chronic fear of environmental doom, mental distress, or anxiety associated with worsening environment conditions or negative emotions related to climate change. The magazine recently reported that Google searches related to climate anxiety are at a record high after steadily increasing over the past 5 years. Through the Climate Reality Project, I've done several climate change presentations at the elementary school level, and I'm particularly conscious of how far to push climate action without creating unnecessary stress for the students. In a study by Carolyn Hickman and colleagues in The Lancet, December 2021, it found that more than 10,000 young people aged 16 to 25 years old living across 10 countries, including the U.S., more than half, 59%, reported being very or extremely worried about climate change, and 84% were at least moderately worried. Today, I'm thrilled we are joined by Jennifer Silverstein, a licensed clinical social worker who works at the intersection of climate justice and early childhood mental health. Jennifer comes to us from Santa Rosa, the traditional territory of the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo tribes. We'll discuss the direct personal impact climate events had on her and her young daughter. Thanks for joining me, Jenny.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, you experienced the impact of climate change firsthand in your community. Can you please tell me about the 2 fires that you went through?
Sure. The first big one was the Tubbs Fire up here in Sonoma County, which at the time was the most destructive fire in California. It did not stay that way for long. And it really was an urban wildfire through Santa Rosa. And Tubbs was 2017. A couple years later, we had the Kincaid Fire, which actually more than half of our county had to evacuate to get away from. And my daughter was 3 and 5 at those times. We evacuated both times, and, we were okay. We have family in the South Bay. We took our cat with us. We had the resources to get out of town, and our house did not burn down. So all together, we were okay. But certainly the psychological impact is tremendous. I don't know anyone in Sonoma County who doesn't react to strong winds. This is years later at this point, and it makes your heart race every time the wind blows.
It's unfortunately the most iconic representation of the climate impact in the Bay Area. It must have been harrowing with your daughter, I imagine.
As a parent, you get in the habit after a fire of being ready to evacuate all the time. I would have my phone on, waiting for the possible emergency alert, and I'd have the bags packed. But the big challenge when my daughter was that young, especially, was I did not want her to have to worry every time I packed the bags. The wind would blow and I would get distressed, and I didn't want her to have to go through that. And so I would try to be ready to go without her realizing. But at the same time, she had so many precious things that I didn't want to leave behind. And so I would lie awake thinking, okay, if I've got everything ready to go except her stuff, and then there is an emergency and I really don't want to leave her stuff behind, where are all those things? It's a privileged problem to have, to be worrying about her objects.
Right. But I think it's relatable because objects hold that emotional weight. I mean, it is something that we think about in the Bay Area and preparation. Of course, the notion that you think about the wind, oh my gosh, just the uptick in wind being a reminder of what's possible. It's intense. How did these fires inform you about the world afterwards? So, I know you got into this particular field, the psychological impacts of these things. How did that intersect?
Well, I am someone who has always known and been concerned about climate change, since the 1980s when I was a child and an environmental activist and so on. But I always assumed there'd be more time. I certainly thought my child would have a childhood before we really felt these impacts. And so when all of a sudden they were very present moment, it changed a lot of things for me. One of the biggest being my private practice. So I primarily had been working with children who experienced trauma at a very early age. That really meant kids who had family relational trauma, kids who were in like the child welfare system were my primary clients. And then after the Tubbs fire, all of a sudden I was getting calls from families with relatively well-functioning family systems. And the reason that there was trauma was the fire. All of a sudden, there was a lot more kids with a lot more need. And there was never enough child therapists to begin with. Now we have wait lists. And it really made me recognize that the individual mental health model, as much as it supports the people who are able to access it, it's not enough. It's not efficient for this time in human history. So it really started changing the way that I look at how to provide mental health. So really my specialty in my work is with the very young, 8 and under. They don't have a big grasp on abstract concepts like climate. A 3-year-old is way too much of a concrete thinker for that. So really the impact that I have been working with is that impact of direct events. When something scary happens that their parents are frightened, they lose their home or they lose someone they love, those impacts are very concrete and have impacted a lot of the kids in our community. The older they get, the more likely they are to have that kind of future worry of climate anxiety. You mentioned the study by Carolyn Hickman and her colleagues, the 59% being extremely worried. The other number that really sticks out for me out of that study in particular, 45% of them felt so distressed that it was impacting their functioning. So it wasn't just like, sometimes I'm worried. It was like, I'm so worried I can't go to school and take care of my immediate needs. So huge impacts.
Can you talk about the importance of community in this respect and a sense of belonging to alleviate the stressors of these anxieties? How do we rely on one another to create a safe space as we move through this climate transition?
I can answer that from so many different perspectives. I'm going to start with my own experience. And between the droughts and the fires and my daughter's early childhood, I was so spun out. I was so anxious about all of this as she was growing up. And for many years, I felt really alone. I couldn't find very many people to talk to about it. People didn't want to talk about it. And then in 2020, I connected with the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America and became a member and then got more actively involved in that organization. And all of a sudden, I wasn't alone. And that has made all the difference in the world. I mean, I've been so strengthened by having that connection. And so that feeds my intellectual knowledge of how important community is,
Right.
And has really inspired me to make that my priority for supporting other people as well. This is a existential worldwide problem. We're not going to solve it by ourselves, and we need to work together. So that's like the foundation. The other piece is we really can't take care of our emotional well-being by ourselves either. And that's a little bit of a myth of particularly the United States, but Western society in general, this idea that we can just plow ahead as an individual. We are completely designed as relational beings. We evolved in social groups. We need each other in order to take care of our emotional well-being. And climate cafes, it's a growing movement to help people be able to connect with others who feel similarly and just have conversation. You can find climate cafes online. Sometimes they're local and in person. Often they're online. They're usually free, and they are just a way to be able to talk to other people who feel similarly.
Can you explain, I read on your website about the concept of cognitive dissonance and moral injury and what that means in respect to all of this?
Sure. My colleague Elizabeth Bouchard and along with our colleague Jennifer Walk, we published a literature review of the emotional dimensions of parental mental health, how climate change is impacting it. And across the board, climate is having an impact on parents' emotions, which is not surprising. And some of the key findings that we really pulled out were these ideas of cognitive dissonance and moral injury. And cognitive dissonance is essentially when we are trying to hold two different beliefs or understandings at once, and they conflict. And it is very, very hard to hold both of them. And so for me, I go back to that example of I don't want my daughter aware that I'm packing to leave, but I want to make sure that I pack all of her important stuff. Like, how do I do both those things? I couldn't. So it kept me awake at night, right? That's cognitive dissonance causes a lot of anxiety. And that's like a very personal, concrete example. Really, we experience that all the time as parents. Like, how do we take care of our children's immediate emotional well-being while also planning for this future that we know is going to be quite different than the present and wanting to contribute to making that future as healthy as possible? Those two things are often in conflict. And so that is where moral injury also comes in. And moral injury basically means our actions are not aligned with our values. We're either participating in an action that's not aligned with our values. Also, people experience moral injury when we're witnessing government and industry behave in ways that we know are not aligned with our values and the well-being of the world. And parents experience moral injury all the time. Everything in my heart and soul is about wanting her to have a healthy life for as long as she lives. You know, it became very real when she was born. But at the same time, I have less time than I did before I was parenting. Money is tighter than before I was parenting. So my day-to-day choices don't reflect those values.
I can totally relate, and so many parents can. And that's where like the whole self-compassion thing comes in, because I found myself getting so tight when I had like you said, when I had my kids about what the right move was for the climate.
There's actually some literature out there about, they call it green parenting, and how much extra stress it can put on parents to try to make these right choices when really the systems are not designed for us to have good choices to make. I mean, these things matter, but the collective matters more.
Yes. Are there other resources or programs that you know about along these lines of how we can support one another?
There is the International Transformational Resilience Coalition, which the idea behind it is that we create community resilience hubs and opportunities for people to come together and be able to get to know one another, support each other. Essentially, climate action will come out of that if we connect and recognize our common needs.
Thanks for joining me, Jenny.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Hey listeners, look below the episode's description to find links to all the resources that Jenny mentioned, including ways you can get involved. If you're looking for a transcript of this episode, it's also waiting for you right there. Did you know that we love feedback? Yep, we really want to hear from you. Please share your thoughts by following the link to our brief listener feedback survey also below. And be sure to hit the follow button to hear about our new monthly episodes as soon as they get released. Thanks for helping us spread the word about this podcast. You can review it, rate it, or share it with a few friends or colleagues. You can also find us on YouTube. For this episode of Everyday Climate Champions, the sound designer was Martin Sanchez, and the executive producer and editor was Dahlia Masacci. I'm your host, Sean Mendelson. Our full production team is listed below.
You've been listening to Everyday Climate Champions, presented by the Climate Reality Project's Bay Area chapter. If you know any local folks who would make great guests, please drop us an email. As Climate Reality founder and former U.S. Vice President Al Gore says, solving the climate crisis is within our grasp, but we need people like you to stand up and act. To learn more, please visit climaterealitybayarea.org. See you next time.